Martin, and Lily Road. Those are three kind of high-density nodes in our 20-year plan. But the pale yellow that you see everywhere, greenish yellow, is designated as low-density residential. And one of the things in our new comprehensive plan that many of you participated in putting together is that area, again, the gentle density, the density of those areas going up just slightly as we fill in with the missing middle type of housing. And what we need to do is figure out how to do that. What are the details? As you know, the devil's always in the details. What are the details? We need to examine our codes and fees. What's the financial feasibility for individuals in terms of getting financing or paying for these things? Some other cities have had programs around pre-approving building plans, sets of building plans, or having other incentives. At the same time, still balance that and retain our consideration of building safety, health and sanitation issues, compatibility with neighborhoods, and environmental protection. So we'll be launching that in late 2016. I have some cards in the back, and as Jill said, there's a place to sign up if you're interested in hearing more about that. That's a community conversation to have about what are the details in terms of how we can fit these kinds of housing into our neighborhoods in a gentle density way and in a way that's compatible with the neighborhoods. So we'll look forward to talking with you all as part of that. And that's all I have this morning. Next.
So let me just start off by putting it a little bit more into context of all the possible housing types that we're talking about. For this presentation, we're really focusing on some of the small and tiny housing types, the accessory dwelling units, the individual tiny home, the tiny home village, and other things like cottage housing that you might have heard of. So I'm Chris. I work for the Northwest Eco Building Guild, and we operate a program called the Code Innovations Database, which is documenting permitting pathways for different types of housing and green building, high performance building innovations that don't always fit the normal zoning codes or the prescriptive codes. And so always somebody is going to champion that, like Jill and her folks did with Quixote Village, to try to get something approved that wasn't really fitting the normal mode, as you said, you know, the missing middle. So we document those individual cases and put them in our database at codeinnovations.org. Our whole point here is to make it easier for folks to follow in the footsteps of those innovators, and so that they can, you know, so that more people can build these innovative types of housing. So Jill already talked a little bit about Quixote Village, and that's where this whole journey started for me, learning about the permitting path that they had to follow in order to put it in the Code Innovations database. You know, the thing that is really remarkable about this is the fact that it provides a way for homeless people to get off the street and find that dignity in housing, and to do it in a way that's affordable for them and also for the rest of the community. And it's not just happening here in Olympia, though. It's happening in places all around the Northwest and the United States. One of the earliest examples of a tiny home village is Dignity Village in Portland, Oregon, where all the homes, all the little tiny units are under 120 square feet, unpermitted, and basically treated by the city as a campground. But because they're unpermitted, you know, people get to help build them in any way they want, as long as they're safe, and so it's an interesting model. I'm going to be talking a little bit about a gentleman named Andrew Keevan, who wrote a book called Tent City Urbanism, and he describes this that these tiny home villages are on a continuum from the tent city, if you will, where Camp Quixote got started, to a very, in-depth, fully permitted individual units that have all the hookups in the bathroom, like Quixote Village. So in between there's some other variations. One of those is in Eugene, Oregon, that I've been spending my last couple of days studying very intensely. It's called Opportunity Village. It's a transitional temporary housing that basically each individual unit is considered a sleeping unit, and then there's a centralized kitchen and a bathroom facility, and they were allowed by the city to only hook up the central unit, and all the individual units were seen as temporary structures, therefore not having to be on full foundations, and not having to have the normal hookups that are required. I want to go back one.
Sure.
Over there. They also are working on another project called Emerald Village. Just go ahead, leave it there.
What was the square footage of the Emerald ones there?
Their Emerald Village, the Opportunity Village is about 100 and, I'm sorry, they're 80 square feet, 8 by 10, and the Emerald Villages are larger. Well, not just. So another example of a kind of a tiny home village is a cottage housing development. And an architect in Langley, Washington named Ross Chapin came up with this idea. And they're obviously larger homes, but they are grouped around a central common area, a courtyard, if you will. And this has been recognized, and in fact, built here in our community. Habitat for Humanity has adopted this cottage housing model and built the Shepherd's Grove development with 5 homes. Fairview Cottages has 15 homes, and their latest one has 33 homes at DOA Vista. Am I saying that right? Does someone know better? All right, so that is cottage housing, and now I need to go forward.
What is the running definition of a cottage house? You say that's cottage.
I think it's 800 to 1,000 square feet, or 18 or to 1250. Thank you.
And
Yeah.
could we hold questions till the end?
Yeah.
Sure.
So I just want to say that this is really a momentum. There's a lot of momentum behind this. Eugene, Oregon, I just mentioned. Lake County, California, the Cornerstone Villages. Madison has occupied Madison Village. Nicholsville in Seattle is really, again at the spectrum of really trying to create something just barely above a tent to live in, but to give people a place where they can be warm at night in the winter. So lots more projects in the works like this. There's a lot of particular challenges that come with this. There's, as Leonard mentioned, the land use zoning codes, maximum density designations, because if you're going to put 30 homes on one lot in a residential neighborhood, that's way over your density required limit. The minimum lot size and building area, actually the lot sizes are too big for tiny home villages, and there's no allowance for multiple houses on one property. And then in the case of Community Village, they got a variance so that their project could be allowed in an industrial zone. On the building code side, we've got limited, the building code has required up until recently 120 square feet to be a habitable dwelling. There's a requirement for all the hookups, which are very expensive to build and to pay the fees for. And if it's too small to be an ADU, then it won't get permitted. You can also have the challenge. It's not allowed to put a single tiny home like Jenn's or many others on a lot for more than 14 days without moving it. So they're kind of looked at as RVs, and so they're limited to how much time they can spend in one place. They also require a bathroom and a sink to be a full dwelling unit, and then there's egress requirements. The ladder access to a sleeping loft is not well looked on, and there are minimum height requirements. So some of the solutions that I could throw out just for conversation for us to consider is to potentially adopt a rule change for ADUs, which Joseph is going to talk more about, accessory dwelling units, and proactively encourage infill gentle densification, as Leonard said, to propose a special permit for a year or more for a tiny home, mobile tiny home to be allowed to stay in one place, knowing that it is sort of more like an ADU than it is an RV. What if we adopted a tiny house development ordinance that allowed a density bonus in those residential neighborhoods so that more of us could live in tiny home villages in residential zones? How about allowing accessory and temporary structures to be used for habitable purposes so we could have more very low-cost tiny home villages like the one in Eugene that was built for under $100,000 compared to Coyote Village, which cost $3 million. So there, that's if we're talking about transitional housing for homeless, then we need to be real creative there. Now, the 2015 International Residential Code limited the minimum size, or reduced the minimum size from 120 square feet to 88. So you can build a smaller home now, so that's moving in the right direction compared to where it used to be. We also might want to look at reducing impact fees for these tiny homes, since it's about $5,000 to $6,000 of impact fees for each dwelling, which is about the same cost as the house itself. So make it proportionate to the size. And then encourage the use of cottage housing code, but maybe adapt it to allow smaller units and increase the number of units per acre. I just want to mention Andrew's book, Tent City Urbanism. It's a really great one. It helps lay out all of these options for tiny home villages. And tiny home villages are just one example of the kind of missing middle that we've been talking about, but it's an example that not only could work for homeless folks finding a place to call their own, but for people like me, who my daughter's off to college now, I would love to live in a tiny home village with a common community house, and I could afford something a little, like maybe a Coyote Village style. That would be really sweet. So anyway, let's look at all those range of options for tiny home villages and hear some more about other options like ADUs and individual tiny homes with Joseph.
Actually,
Oh, Jenn's next.
or just the next.
Great. Great, you're your switcher. Sorry if I talked too fast, I was on the time.
Okay. My slide shows just photos of, oh, by the way, I'm Jenn Klese. I'm a tiny house designer, not by trade, and tiny house builder, also not by trade. And this is just a slideshow of,
I guess it's gonna run this.
click on the recommended settings. What do I do? Click on recommended settings. Okay, I'm not a Windows person. Okay, it's finished, okay. All right. Great, okay. So I think it's going out, okay. So, in probably like 2010, I think, or maybe it was 2009, I was living on the west side of town in a 1,000-square-foot house, rental house, with my partner Kim. And down the street from us lived this woman named Joseph, who some of you know, who lives in a tiny house on the west side of Olympia, and wrote a book about tiny houses, and there she is. She showed us her tiny house, and we were like, wow, that's really interesting and cool, and we could totally never do that. But then, and we were actually really wanting to buy the house that we were renting. We loved it so much. It had a beautiful yard, and we wanted to live there. But then, these are all people who helped build. The more that we thought about it, the more that we realized that the mortgage and the price of that mortgage on our lives and how we wanted to live our lives was just too great, and we needed more flexibility because neither of us have gone to grad school yet. We were kind of, well, maybe we want to go to grad school. We don't know, so we were like, maybe this tiny house thing is actually a good idea, because it means that we can invest in something that is our own and not just give like thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to fund somebody else's retirement when we could like barely save for our own. So we're like, well, let's downsize. And we started a tiny house club with Dee and a couple of other friends who were all also interested in building tiny houses, and just got together and drank tea, had cookies, and chatted a lot. And I decided to go to, because I didn't know anything about designing or building, and so I ended up going to this designer build school in Vermont called Yes Tomorrow, and took their home design course. It's like a week-long course. You can hang out with a couple of architects, and they teach you how to draft, and then you just kind of like walking through the process, and they're just kind of looking over your shoulder and be like, hey, maybe you should do that. You're like, oh, okay, you try that. Erase, 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 draw lines, erase more. And after like a year after that I took that course, I finally had a set of plans, and we, by that time, had saved enough money to start building. But as some of you may know, if you've tried, there is really actually no real true financing for tiny houses. So the way that we ended up doing it is we downsized as much as we possibly could. We moved into a partially finished barn on some friend's property, so we didn't have running water, we just had electricity and heat, and made do for really cheap rent so that we could save as much money as possible while we were building. We did like max out our credit cards and stuff like that to make it happen. And after about a year and a half, working with friends and some professionals, my house was finished. We started Ken's house because we didn't think that living as a couple in a tiny house was a really good idea. So we planned to build 2 tiny houses and sit next door to each other, which is the case now. But her story is a longer and more winding road because the next year we were like, whoa, building my house was so insane and really stressful. Why don't we work with a builder for her house? So we ended up working with a friend his brother, who was still working on her house, but unfortunately, long story short, a barn next to the tiny house that was halfway finished caught on fire. Her house caught on fire, totally destroyed. All the money lost, and at that time there was no real insurance to get for building a tiny house or a finished tiny house. And because of the tragedy of that, D. Williams worked really, really, really hard with this insurance agent that just came to one of her tiny house fixers that happened in Portland, I think monthly or quarterly or whatever. And they worked together and they finally came up with a product. So now there is tiny house insurance available, at least from one. And I think it's like through Lloyd's of London or something. And like, I don't know. Yeah, Superstars and my tiny house. So, what else are we going to talk about? Financing. Oh yeah. Then we did a Kickstarter. It was like an Indiegogo campaign for Ken's house. Got some money from that. It was able to somewhat kind of like knock off the difference of like how much she was hit back financially, and built her house. We have lived outside the county. We're currently living in the city, and we love it. And so I have tons of things to keep an information about that.
A late arriving panelist, Joe Becker, who is a builder. Joe, take it away.
And I'm going to go to personal stories without a slideshow because I've been at eco-villages building cottage housing and working on tiny houses, and I'm really full. So I didn't do a slideshow, but I can...
Oh, so Joe, before you start, 5 minutes and watch her because she'll tell you when you're done.
Okay.
Interpreter dance.
So I'm a builder that focuses on natural and ecological materials and owner participation. I'm a contractor and consultant for over 10 years in Olympia, but I travel a lot, specializing in these very ecological, most ecological structures that people want to build their dreams. And I cultivate celebrations of shared experience around buildings, so I do a lot of work party culture, owner-builder facilitation, and then I work as a contractor as well, so it's kind of like a hybrid between conventional contracting model and this really kind of out there building really beautiful hobbit houses or earthen homes, really least toxic materials. So I was just at the Port Townsend Eco Village for the past 2 days, helping somebody building such a art piece of a hobbit home with a natural finish. And they have it's just an example. I've got so many examples of these kinds of inspiring things. And I'm just really curious, who's excited about tiny houses specific? How many people are here for tiny? I'm just curious.
If you're not,
Specific
why are
tiny
you
houses.
here?
Half-ish. Is anybody here specifically interested in ADUs or knows what an ADU is and is here about that subject?
What is an ADU,
Or
Joseph?
DAs.
What an ADU is an accessory dwelling unit, which is a class of zoning and a permit that you can get to build a second habitable unit on a standard residential lot. Most people don't realize it's possible, but it's a vehicle for density, low-cost living, rentals potentially, intergenerational housing, and they can squeeze in above garages, attached to your house, or detached, and their max is 800 square feet, or 2/3 of the size of your primary dwelling in this town. which would be one recommendation for changing, because there's a lot of 500 square foot houses in this town, or 600 square foot. So how could maybe, if it's 1,200 or more, you get 800 max, but if it's 1,200 or less, maybe you can get close to 100% size in an ADU. But anyway, there's a lot of recommendations, a lot of policy tweaks that you can make to the ADU code. But really, every house that has room for one, I think, could be potential. And one of my favorite things is it kind of puts the power and the inspiration of development into the hands of the people, into the hands of the homeowners that own these houses. That's one of my favorite things. And so I've been pushing for ADU programs and policy changes for 5 years now, but I don't have a lot of time, so I keep trying to reel in college students or interns or high-capacity citizens to create programs like you all. So when the city starts developing this program, is anybody here interested or excited to help develop maybe we
Name in the bag.
So you talked about that.
Yeah.
Great. So ADUs, there's a lot of really cool programs around the country that support ADU development, whether it's a set of pre-approved plans, that might have associated designers with them that can help give you something like that doesn't have a huge review process. There's guidebooks in Seattle and Vancouver, Santa Cruz, and these guidebooks have been actually said to be open source, that the City of Olympia can tap into them and remake them. Give them credit, but remake them. And to create a couple of guides and pre-approved plan sets would really help. And so the city is really open here, and they have a great program, and they have a good code. And there are some limitations, parking spaces, and gotta look like the house. But things are, there's ways to petition some of the things. And so ADUs are really inspiring thing. Cottage housing, this co-housing development in Port Townsend called the Port Townsend Eco Village has a cluster of cottage houses that are all 1,200 square feet or less. Some of them have ADUs attached, so it's a 700 square foot house with a 500 square foot ADU, and it's all under 1,200 square feet, and they're sharing. Some of them have tenants in common, where the ADU and the primary dwelling have 2 owners, and they split equity. And there's a developer in Portland, Eli Spivak, Orange Splat Development, who's a superhero and inspiration, and he's got a number of ADU and primary house development, micro developments that split ownership, so that the ADU, and I'll give an example of his project, Severn Green, has 4 houses. It's got 2 primary houses. It's a double lot. It's got a primary house that was old, that renovated, and a second main house, and they're all 15 to 2,000 square foot, and they've been spruced up, and one's new, and then they built 2 ADUs in the back, 800 square feet and 500 square feet, and then they put all 2 lots into a condominium. So 4 owners bought into the condo. They have a little tea house that's shaped like a nautilus shell in the middle, and then the 2 ADUs, they have equal ownership of the land, but their buy-in was based on a square footage ratio compared to the front houses. So the front houses, because they were bigger, subsidized the land cost for the ADU homeowners. And when Eli sold these ADUs to the public in kind of like a classic developer fashion, the 800 square foot one sold for $150,000, and the 550 square foot one sold for $100,000 or $110,000 or something. And it's a really sweet model of like really efficiently making use of 2 lots, having a little bit of a community, and subsidizing some smaller low-income housing in Portland proper. And check out his website at Orange Splat. It's really inspiring. I also am building 2 tiny houses, and just to echo Jenn's, I'm building a tiny house for me and my wife and my 8-year-old. And I have a second tiny house, and so we're going to have a family 2 tiny house situation soon, so we can get away from each other a little bit. But they're both 200 square feet with a full loft, and I'm not technically allowed to live in them, except if I have an open permit for a primary dwelling. So I'm a builder, so I'm going to build a primary dwelling slowly out of pocket that's going to be small, and live in the 2 tiny houses for 5 years maybe. My wife hopes 3. Maybe 2, but I know a lot of owner builders that take 7 years, so if I go 5 or 3, that's great. But yeah, it's an amazing opportunity to scale down, and it's really inspiring actually. We're getting ready to start scaling down in this next fall. We're going to finish this tiny house this winter, and we have a building lot on the west side that we're going to do this all on. We've been saving money to do this for a while, so. Anyway, I'm happy to be part of the panel, and I'm here as a resource in the community for questions on non-toxic materials and ecological design build stuff and tiny houses and ADUs, and I look forward to the program and the new developments that we work on together.
Okay, Chris. Sure. Okay, so I have just a handful of questions, and then we'll open it to the audience. So my first question, maybe Leonard would answer this one, maybe all of you would answer this one, or some of you would answer this one. What would it take to get private developers to build tiny houses or tiny house rental communities?
I'll just start, and I'm sure Chris and Joseph have more probably to add. I think what we're planning on doing is part of it. I mean, we need to do an analysis of our codes, our fees, our requirements, and how those may be serving as obstacles or at least disincentives to doing this, and be a little more permissive around it. Again, balancing that with safety and health and other considerations. So that's a community discussion we are already planning to launch, and again, please let us know, give us your contact information. We'll start building our interested parties list right now, tonight, and we'll get that kicked off in the next few months. But from a actual feasibility standpoint, and actually a pro forma for how you build a house, I would defer to Joseph or Chris to address that part of it, because there's a lot of financial issues too.
Well, as you can see with the cottage housing model, that is being worked on, that is being used in a number of communities. Habitat for Humanity is doing it with some subsidies, I assume, and with the sweat equity of the owners. But that's a little bit different model. But Ross Chapin, there's a cottage housing company that works with Ross Chapin, and they are able to do it. Just a standard development, usually where the individual units are owned individually, and they're sort of a condo or a smaller lot development where they individually own the units and then own the land or the common space in between the units collectively. Now, one of the big things, if we wanted to see more tiny house villages that were for everyone, including those who don't have houses and those who do currently, one of the things that would make that really challenging to do as something like Community Village to do as a developer is that the best place to do, the only place you're allowed to build something that has that many units on one lot is in a high density zone, which could be built with a big apartment building. And so the best value, the best use of that land is for a large scale development that's going to maximize profit, the number of units, etc. And so to build little tiny houses that aren't going to sell for very much on the land that could be used like that, it would be really difficult to make it work. But if you went to residential zone and increase your density limits for this particular type of development, then it might make sense to do that. You want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, my parents live in a manufactured home community, and it's really inspiring to see. It happens to be a really nice one with views of the mountains and the water, and but the density is amazing and inspiring. And how do you utilize? And I know somebody who's part of a camping club that has RVs and could have all tiny houses and manufactured homes. So there's some infrastructure for this kind of stuff. I think it's probably mostly grandfathered in, and there's not a lot of room for new stuff. But I'm curious, because there's a huge demand, and as our, I get calls a lot, and as our baby boomers are retiring, and a lot of them don't have a lot of savings, they're going to be forced to live in RVs and manufactured homes, and there's going to be a huge population.
Millennial generation that don't necessarily have the buying power that previous generations did, And so, you know, between the young and the old, there's this giant, you know, demand that is not going to be met by the current housing types.
Well, and then, I was just thinking about this, and in a way, the question, I mean, when I think about me and my response to my financial situation, it was like, that I took it into my own hands. And I think that that's really what's happening, is more and more people are becoming builders of their own homes, which was the way it was, you know, a long time ago, where everybody was building their own home. And so maybe it's not as much about getting developers to capitalize on tiny houses, but more like, what can we do to make it easier for people to be owner builders?
Right, right. So,
But what does infrastructure look like for that? Because it's not the most efficient necessarily, but it is, to me, I work with a lot of owner builders, it is so deep and inspiring. And the reason I do it is that stewardship you gain from working on your own house or participating in the building translates to all parts of your life, and it's going to save more resources in the long term than even the tiny house itself. It's the stewardship ethic that people get. So how do you develop an infrastructure for that? That's an awesome...
That's somebody else's job.
That's an awesome question.
But I think that the thing is, it's like, go where the motivation is. The people are already motivated to do it, so let's find a way to make it more possible and to regulate around it in a way that, like, I mean, I built my house on trust of like, okay, I'm kind of legal, I'm kind of not legal, I don't really know what I am, but this is what I have to do if I want to own my own home. And so I had to go into this with a lot of risk. How can we make it so that there's not as much risk for the owner builder?
right, right.
Yeah, and having a place to put it is really important for the people that are taking this risk. It's really a critical thing that people face in our community. And yes, there's places here, but it's always tentative.
Well, if we buy a piece of property and then put a tiny house on it and try to live on it, if it's not a permitted dwelling, then you're illegal.
Right, right. And I don't mean to make this either or, because I totally endorse what both of you are saying about the awesomeness of being able to build your own house. However, if you are disabled in America, the supplemental security income that you get if you're too disabled to work is $733 a month. And that and food stamps is all the income you are ever going to have, period. Similarly, when you talk about the retiring boomers, there are going to be an enormous number of people who worked at minimum wage jobs most of their adult lives and will retire with the minimum Social Security, which is not much more than what you get on disability. And those two groups are going to create a huge, huge crisis in super low rental price apartments. And they are not the populations who are going to be capable of building their own homes. So I think both phenomena are true.
Can I check one more thing on the development side? I've lived in co-housing in Vermont and eco-villages in Port Townsend, and all these models, Camp Coyote, they make economic sense, both for the developers and the owners or renters or whatnot, because you have this opportunity to share resources, whether it's a community kitchen or a guest room or a heating system. The community I lived in Vermont had 25 houses on a shared wood-fired boiler that piped hydronics everywhere. And this was fancy, but you can share anything, and it could be laundry, it could be, it is much more cost-effective to share what makes sense to share. And obviously, not everything sometimes wants to be shared, but
And most importantly, maybe you're sharing the land cost, which is the highest driver of prices for housing anyway. So if you're sharing that land cost, and we've talked about a lot of different methods to do that, there's a lot of different ways to do that, but all of these models share that land cost, and that's really one of the big keys. How can we allow that to happen and not always require just one unit per lot?
So how do we incentivize shared elements?
Yeah.
Because all condominiums have some elements that are shared. They might just look like the roof or the sidewalk or whatever in the condominium mid-rise. The condominiums don't have to be mid-rise. The condominium laws and ownership structures are very established, and developers know them well. And how do you incentivize people sharing resources, because then that can bring the price down,
Right.
and it can happen at all kinds of scales, from Cadillac homes 400 acres in Vermont, like the one I was on, to, you know, an SRO, single room occupancy, more like dormitory style living, or tiny house, village, and community, and everything in between. Yeah. Anyway.
Okay, I'm standing up just so I can see everybody. It's time for your questions. Yes.
So my son has a house in Albuquerque. He divided off one room and turned it into a studio and lives in it. Decides he needs more room, so he bought a prefab 10 by 12 shed. Is going to insulate it and put power in it and use it as a bedroom. Any comments on that?
Survivor.
He thinks it's just, well, I mean, we love gorgeous looking tiny houses. He's practical. He thinks this is the practical way to go.
Then he's right. If he thinks it and he lives it. Yes.
I wanted to go back to something that Leonard said. If I remember your numbers rightly, you said 13,000 single-family homes, 45% of which would be single-family, and by 2035. I just want to break that down for a minute. Let's take, for the sake of round numbers, 6,000 of those are single-family homes. So the 13, 6,000 family homes. From here to 1935 is roughly 15 years. What you're talking about is 400 housing units, homes per year. That's the size of the problem. If you were to say, for example, well, 10% of those would be our goal for tiny homes or ADUs or whatever, that's 40 a year. That's the size of the problem we're looking at. And I'll just remind you that, as I mentioned to Mayor Gadwell, back when you first passed the ADU ordinance, frankly, they were so successful that in 3 years, 13 ADUs were constructed. And emboldened by that success, they tightened the rules, so there hasn't been much since.
I agree. The rules are very tight right now, and that's, you know, we've had Joseph participated on some panels previously for the City of the Planning Commission, and you know, there's definitely momentum to have that conversation now and really look at that. I do want to go back to the other comment that the other gentleman made. You know, there is still, you know, public safety kinds of issues, personal safety kinds of issues, health and sanitation issues. We do, you know, as wonderful as tiny homes can be, they can also become really difficult if not done right in terms of, you know, safety for people occupying them, or sanitation issues for people if there's a bunch of them in a lot that doesn't, for example, doesn't have sewer service or that kind of thing. So we got to balance all of that in that discussion, and that's really where the hard discussion comes.
Yeah, it was interesting with the City of Eugene permitting those temporary structures as habitable. They looked, each one has a permit. And the way that they did it was by showing that they had the central service, that they would not have the electrical hookups, and by not having the electrical hookups or gas hookups in each individual unit, it became less hazardous if there was an earthquake, because it wouldn't cause a fire or some other, you know, damage. And they actually did engineering calculations to show that the tiny units would not collapse in an earthquake, so they were able to show those health and life safety units. But they had to be really creative to get there and to work with the project, to organize project designers to make it happen. And they had to be proactive, and really, the city really wanted to make it happen, and they found a way.
Yes, I think the first ADU ordinance was passed back in 1995, and the reason it was restrictive was because it was very hard to convince neighborhoods. It was very hard to convince neighborhoods that to allow for ADUs. There was a lot of opposition to allowing ADUs. And at that time, we allowed, it didn't have to be owner occupied. And actually a builder came in because several Evergreen students had moved into the ADU in this neighborhood and had lots of parties, came into the council, and so then they made it more restrictive. So it's great to see this enthusiasm behind it, because there was an enthusiasm. Right. In 95 it was, and nothing's happened, and nobody's taken the initiative to change things to make it easier.
I'd like to ask the audience if some of you have concerns about this sort of thing. Are we all like happily in complete unison and support of all kinds of ADUs and tiny homes, or are there some people from neighborhood associations that may have some of these
Who in
concerns?
this crowd would dare speak?
Some neighborhoods didn't even want duplexes.
Yeah.
The east side neighborhood asked us to downzone their neighborhood, so they
I can
not to
channel,
allow duplexes.
I could channel them for a second to just say that I think some of the concerns are that, you know, if you have a lot of ADUs in your neighborhood, you're gonna get more renters and more cars, and you know, and not having the ownership in the neighborhood may actually draw down value of the property in your neighborhood. So there's some of those things to contend with, but I think the overall, personally, I think the benefits outweigh the potential costs and, you know, enhancing our neighborhoods.
Do you also see political opposition from like the traditional building community that would rather be forced, have people forced to build big stuff?
It seems to me that it's not so much opposition as disinterest. Is that true?
Yeah, and I certainly can't speak for the builders or the building market, but we haven't, you know, had, as Holly mentioned, we haven't had a lot of applications. How much of that is because of the difficulty under the regulations or the financing, and how much of it is sort of a promotion of single-family home ownership and larger homes and that sort of thing, and that's what a lot of builders specialize in right now. You know, I don't know how much of each of those factors contributes to that. I couldn't speak to that. Probably maybe others can who are builders or
yeah, if there's demand, I think they would definitely go for it.
Is there a developer in the house?
I tried. I tried to buy a church and make it into housing, but the existing zoning, the parking requirements, 50%, you know, permeable surface on site, you just couldn't even get parking. So as long as the same building requirements are put that were existing, and if you change of use, you have to meet all the current requirements. So unless some changes are made so that you can see what you're trying to achieve, and then have a separate layer on there that makes it easier, it's pretty hard to be creative and like take a church and do 12 units, housing units or something. They say, well, now it's no longer a church, now it's an apartment. Well, so now you have to meet all the current requirements, so it's just impossible. So it's just vacant, it's sitting on our Puget. You guys know that church.
Oh, that would be awesome.
I got the plans for you.
I can buy that empty church. Over here.
I no longer work for a construction company, but I was a designer for a construction company, and we were all really excited about tiny homes and small living spaces, and the other builders were as well. There just wasn't a clear code pathway to permitting them. So if there isn't a clear pathway, then we're not going to go for it. But as soon as all
This one's Noah.
How do you spell it?
N-O-A-H.
Oh, in the back standing up. I'm being really random on who I bought.
It's an experiment. Community alternative.
You presented a lot of data in how we're moving forward, and that there's going to be some necessity for this type of housing. I'm glad you're engaging the community to gauge interest, but from the city point, you already recognize that there is a need. So instead of waiting around for citizens to change the laws, knowing that there needs to be change, what is the city doing? While there's clear cutting happening, housing, individual houses are not selling on the deep in the west side, and they're vacant. So how is that being managed?
Well,
compared to tiny houses?
Yeah, so we have, as I was mentioning earlier, we have a lot of area that is zoned for single-family housing. We don't actually, the city doesn't actually build that, obviously, but if a builder feels there is a market and comes in and gets their permit and goes through that process, they can certainly build it. Whether they sell it or whether it's vacant is kind of their judgment call, and that's the risk that builders take all the time, is trying to go through that process. I guess to your point about why not move faster, if I'm hearing you right, the city is the entire community. There's 50,000 people in the city, and in my experience, in almost 30 years of working in local governments and state government, is if you try to move faster than the people and don't allow that opportunity to engage and have that longer conversation, it ends up backfiring typically. There will be concerns by some people, and there will be different perspectives, and there will be lots of back and forth, I think, in this. I think one of the things that I hope people are taking away from this is, well, we're talking at fairly high level right now, that we do need more different kinds of housing. When we start talking about, each one of your neighborhoods, or each one of, one particular piece of property, or something happening in a certain location, that becomes much more of a difficult conversation in terms of the neighbors, in terms of what's already happened in that area, what the long-term future of that area looks like, what are the services that are needed, is it an area that already has sewer and water and adequate roads and those sorts of things, or do those need to be put in? So there's a whole lot of issues when you get down to more of the details that we really need to talk through and say, what are the minimum requirements that might still be needed, but maybe they're not the same set of requirements we have now. Maybe we can address some of the things and provide more creative ways to get there, and more clear pathways, as this gentleman mentioned, for builders, whether they're owner builders or whether they're more commercial or traditional builders. How can we get to that while still having that conversation as a whole community? And it just takes time. It's very difficult, and the city really, again, in my experience, we move forward too fast. That will backfire, and then there will be pushback significantly. So we need to kind of proceed through that conversation.
So,
Yeah.
one second. You're trying to engage us in that conversation while individual houses are, you're saying that's on the builder and developer, but we, as a community, we're not engaged there. And what's the accountability for future development such as those?
The accountability for them is they go broke if they don't sell. It's the market accountability. Joseph wanted to add that.
Well, it's really hard to, balance the free market with law and the public good, or some perception of, we're living in a very kind of like Adam Smith economic model here, and that's, and there's some social policies that we do have that are progressive, but it's a slow boat to turn, kind of thing, and may never turn. But it's a challenge. But one suggestion I have that is kind of outside the boundaries of changing zoning, and really working on some alternative zoning plans and options. Like, okay, I have single-family zonings, R 4 to 8. That's 4 to 8 units per acre. If I'm in this zone, can I make a petition for clustering or some density bonus for tiny houses, and those actually exist a little bit already in the cottage housing zoning. The developers really have to get inspired, and so to do that on some level, I think there's a lot of opportunities that aren't being met, except by very few evolved, inspired developers, because most of the developers are just too busy making money how they're making them. And they don't know the alternatives because it's not out there enough. So there's experimental zones like that. You can create experimental zoning, experimental permit options if you meet, say, the Living Building Challenge, or I know the Earthship communities in New Mexico has an experimental zone. In Santa Cruz, there's a whole kind of policy experimental division with the building department that you can get alternative permits for. So there's a number of options. So that's kind of somewhere between like the full policy change and renegade stuff that happens without a permit. And
in defense of the city, I would say a little bit that they've been getting a lot done lately with the comp plan and moving us in this direction. They've really moved a lot of motion. And so I think when the planning commission takes this up in the fall, and then next year the council takes this up, one thing that we didn't have years ago was the kind of support and enthusiasm for it that we have now. So I would like to challenge the city and all of us to make sure that this happens quickly, that we start this process and we don't let it lag, that we make some stuff happen so we can start seeing this development happening in the next 2 to 3 years.
Okay, you, and then you standing up, and then you. How's that?
Well,
Really interested in gender balance.
it's really fascinating, first and foremost, because there are so many people here. I mean, this interest has not existed in the Olympia that I have known since 1980. So I'm with Holly there. But what's fascinating too is I have a next door neighbor here who keeps talking tiny house, and then I look around my 2,500 square foot 1972 Rambler and I think, this could be a beautiful 3 houses. All I'd have to do is add a new bedroom on top of the garage and put a kitchen in the living room. And 3 new houses, boom, inside my house. And hasn't that been the way in the past? I mean, that's kind of an old
The boarding house.
form, isn't it? No, not a boarding house. Everybody gets, it's a condo inside an existing 2,500 square foot
Converted,
house.
yeah.
Right, and I think Leonard showed a couple of those in his initial slideshow of older, big houses that have been divided into.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many I've read in this neighborhood, it's amazing. I mean,
Nothing
there are.
There aren't any.
Well, one thing I guess, you know, many of you probably know where some of that has happened where, you know, we don't know at the city that it's happened. It may have been done without permits, but there's also ways to do accessory dwelling units internal to your existing house, or, you know, some divisions, depending again on the zoning and those sorts of things. So while it can occur in some of the zones, that right now it would not be allowed in some of the zones. So that's why sometimes it happens without us knowing about it. But I think that's a really good example. This missing middle, which is we've got, you know, one person living in a very large house and would like to divide that up and be able to benefit from it from an income standpoint, and the people moving in obviously benefit. I think the community benefits, you know, again, if it's done right and sensitive to the neighborhood, that's a great way to increase gentle density, support transit, support perhaps maybe commercial uses that couldn't have been viable earlier. So those are all, yeah, that's a great example of that.
Yeah, if your cul-de-sac agrees.
Exactly. You know, that's why we have to have a big conversation.
The parking is a big issue.
Right, but what we learned about the city is that everything is complaint driven, so if nobody complains, you can build.
That's without a permit. That's a non-permit.
Which is why, like, when I cited, when Kim and I cited our houses in Olympia proper, like, we, like, went around to all the neighbors, talked to everybody, and, like, everybody knows who we are, we know what we're doing, and no problems.
Yeah.
But it's like about having that.
Complaint is you have to move out because you're basically a trailer.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah,
sorry.
and that's why I work really hard on all my neighborhood relations.
That's
just
part of
the
it might
trade-off.
be a shame to lose that.
You know? I mean, I would do it anyways. I mean, my partner is like, she like pretends to be the mayor of Olympia sometimes, like the way that she's so friendly.
I was thinking your partner would be happy.
Yeah, I've been working on getting permits, ADU project permitted with the city right now. And I'd like to know more about, how to have an impact on the shifting some of those regulations around that, because I've had experience with some of the planners there where they have said, well, 2 years ago I was told, the height restriction right now is 16 feet from average grade to mid-gable, but that's, that's been proved to be problematic when you actually try to design one of these things that's livable.
For a two-story, to make a two-story.
Yeah, to make it two-story, something with a small footprint, which has a lot of advantages in terms of, permeability stuff,
And lot sizes and
yeah, all that stuff. So they were like, so if you want to wait a couple years, you have a good chance of having more options that way. And sort of inadvertently, I waited a couple of years, and when I went back and asked, how's that going? The person I talked to was a different person. She's like, oh, there's never been a committee about that. We've never been considering that. That is not an option. Just really obstructionist. And the frustrating thing about it, hearing some of what's being said tonight, is that it sounds like there are opportunities to, I felt like talking about this, that, you know, citizens are a really important part of the city and what drives policy, but the city, somebody who's working for the city is not channeling my energies and opinions towards those opportunities. She's just being obstructionist. And that was really frustrating because I feel like, because I'm working really hard to do a high quality project that I think is going to be an asset to the community. So I would love to see the city do a little more training around that, around, you know, because it could also be a really nice diplomatic tool for them.
What about board variances? I mean, without changing the
I
code,
asked about that, and again, it was just like, we would never consider, I asked if that was possible, she said it wasn't even possible, that there was no point in applying.
So, just to kind of clarify some of that, and I'm just gonna try to explain some of that. You know, certainly 2 years ago, we were near the end of our comprehensive planning process, and again, the lot city participated for, I think, 5 years on that. And it was calling for change along those lines. So I think it was fair that that person said that at that time. We didn't actually have it on the work program yet. We didn't, you know, with a very small number of staff, it's, you know, certain things have to be done in order, and we haven't gotten to that. It's now on the work program for later this year. In the meantime, and I'm sorry about maybe how that came across from our other staff person, I guess technically it's true, we haven't had change, as Holly mentioned earlier, since 1990s in the ADUs, and so I guess, well, the manner and the tone may not have been helpful. That was sort of technically accurate in that we haven't made changes.
Well, it's not accurate,
but
there's
she
not
should
been
have, you know,
discussion.
yeah,
That's
should have.
what she's saying, that it hasn't been under discussion.
Yeah, and it hadn't up until that time. Well, it had in the comp plan, I guess, at the
Yeah.
policy level, but the actual regulation and changes is what we're going to be launching into in the details.
Yeah.
And then I guess the other piece, a lot of people ask about variances, and that's there's a lot of kind of statewide limitations on variances. There's a whole legal structure for variances in the courts and through court cases and stuff. I won't get into all of that, but it is very, very limited when variances can actually go through. Sometimes that term's used for other things where the city staff may have some discretion in how we interpret things. That's not technically a variance, but using that word just kind of triggers this whole legal limitations that we really don't even have a lot of discretion about. But one of the things I think we should look at in terms of our process coming up for ADUs and other things is what are the options? I mean, there may be a sort of standard path or standard set of regulations, but in this case, you know, we could create some options, some flexibility in there. Not a variance per se, but in these cases it might be a little different. In this kind of case it might be a little different. We can actually build that in. And I think that's something we need to have that conversation about because it may be different under different circumstances where an ADU could fit or maybe not so.
So Leonard, if you say this is on the work plan for later this year, I'm asking this question on your behalf. How long would it take for that to become effective? How long is the wait? How long is the wait?
Well, that goes back to my earlier response. I mean, again, in my experience, you have to have that conversation as a community, and I guess, unfortunately, it's frustrating, but it depends. It has to be the answer. It depends on how that conversation goes. It depends on how much we hear from folks supportive or people with concerns, and how we can have that conversation to address those concerns and bring it forward in a way that can get at least most of the community behind it. Because bringing something forward that turns into a major battle really isn't helpful to anybody. And so how long it takes to have that conversation, could be 3 months, could be 6 months, could be 9 months. I just don't know how long it might take. But
okay, you heard it, 9
really
months.
One thing that I've always wondered is if the staff is overworked and understaffed, how do we become more community about like shared responsibility, and how does that infrastructure get created?
Hold that thought. I want to honor that this person has been waiting for a long time, and then we'll come back to that. Yes.
Okay, and pulling back from just Olympia, I'm a greener, West Side greener, but I live in Seattle now. I'm so sorry for the traffic. It wasn't me. But and I'm crazy about tiny houses and want to build something specifically in my front yard. I don't have a backyard. when you guys are at the planner meetings and the conferences and you're hanging out at wherever you hang out afterwards during, is there a conversation about tiny houses, particularly, and tiny houses on wheels? And is there, in general, is there support? And is it just the worker bees that are supportive, or is it the heads, or do we have to wait for people to retire or die off, or, this kind of thing? So I'm just kind of wondering what the big regional Puget Sound conversation is, because we're battling this in Seattle too, and I know someone who just lost her bazillion-dollar tiny house on wheels. She can't rent it out. I mean, it's a whole other thing, but she can't rent it out right now because it's so whatever it is.
Yeah. Well, just maybe a quick reminder of all your civics classes you took in high school and all of that. The staff is working for the elected officials who work for the people.
Yes.
Really, and so that's how change happens. If we have enough support for changing regulatory framework, the staff implements that regulatory framework. Whatever's adopted by a city council in our case is what we implement. And the city council is going to listen to their constituents, and that's why, as Ollie explained earlier, she was on the city council at that time frame, a lot of concern about how ADUs, for example, might fit into a neighborhood at that time. Now there seems to be, at least as I hear it, a lot more support. By the way, there is certainly among planners and conferences and that, and the numbers of sessions and detailed discussions about ADUs and tiny homes and other middle types of housing is huge, because there are a lot of benefits from it. But at the same time, I think, again, as we have the community conversation, I'll be very interested to hear the whole conversation, and of course our elected officials will as well. What are people who might have some concerns? People might be wanting to make sure that there's some sort of safeguards, if you will, against the party houses or some of those things that might occur as well, and what the parking situation is, or other concerns. So, we have to go through that process. That's how the regulations change, and then the staff can certainly implement that.
So I'm just wondering if you're talking about it.
Absolutely.
Okay. So I have an idea. I know I'm feeling bad about all the people who are standing and uncomfortable, and I'm wondering if it would, what the sense of the audience is. We could do like 2 more questions, and then maybe adjourn a few minutes early, and then mill around, and the panelists could be available.
Gotta be out of
We know we have to end by 8:30, but we don't have to go until 8:30. And I'm wondering about all the people who are standing and uncomfortable, if you're good with maybe adjourning a little bit early.
I just have a comment if I can.
Could somebody answer my question, please?
Yes.
Okay, I'll find me. Okay, so 2 more questions and then we're done. Go for it.
Okay, I just want to pick up where this woman back here left off. And I know of pump houses and sheds, wood sheds, and all kinds of little tiny structures that have been turned into living spaces all over the city. They're everywhere. People have taken their houses and turned them into apartments, and they share the kitchen all over the place. And all of these are done without a permit because there's no way to get a permit. And so, the city is 100 years behind right now, this whole thing. And it's not about building a $60,000 tiny house. It's about building something you can afford. That's crazy. Or $150,000 cottages? You gotta be kidding. This is about affordable housing. And meanwhile, there's houses in foreclosure all over town that are rotting, which drives me nuts. Talk about a waste of resources. So there's something seriously upside down right here. And what we need, because I've gone to City Hall trying to get a permit for like an ADU on my garage, and it's 16 feet was it, so that was it. No, can't do it. All kinds of obstructionists and the people, God, if they even think that you're disrespecting them, you're just screwed, because they can interpret it any way they want. They can tell you that your fence has to be set back 15 feet from your property line. I've heard that one. It's just crazy talk out of planning. So, some changes there could be really helpful. Just people who want to help people instead of obstruct. Because that's my experience.
Yeah, I'm sorry that you feel that's your experience. I think, again, the regulations are what we have to administer. We can't make up your regulations.
They get made up all the time. I see it all the time.
I'd love to hear directly about that specifically. Example, my card's in the back. I would love to hear examples because that's.
I have one good example. One great example of progress is I thought it was hilarious when I moved from Olympia to Seattle, I think in the 70s and 80s. You could not grow food in your backyard in the suburbs. I thought that was hilarious. And collectively, the United States has said this is hilarious. You can go anywhere in the United States now, and there's very few places left that if you decide to grow more than just a tiny vegetable plot, you want to really put some corn in, that you're not going to get shut down. In fact, there are beekeepers in the central part of Seattle, which is shocking to me. Now there's a neighborhood argument over bees, but we're doing it, so that's good news. The second thing I would put out is about tiny houses. One thought about tiny houses that concerned me that I think all of you should take away: sound. What we have is you have a 300 square feet, 300 square feet when you get a mate. Okay, now the two of you are living in 600 square feet and you're walking between the houses all day long. What usually happens is something that's actually rather wonderful. You get a Calistoga wagons in a circle. You get multiple units and everybody's walking between the units. You can do it in the woods, you can do it in an urban environment, but everyone needs to start being aware that that's going to be audible at 3 in the morning. You go from one building to the next. The door opens, the door closes. It's just like cars in a city. There's all kinds of regulations to stop too many cars from coming in the middle of the night. So I just throw that one
Yeah,
in.
and people talking out of turn. Yes.
Thank you. There are a lot of things that can be frustrating in this process, but there are some things that are wonderful. And I'm curious, I've seen houses on the East Coast, tiny houses on wheels, that people are using mycelium infill in the walls, both as a form of insulation and soundproofing. Dignity Village, when it was built, some of the first experimental light straw clay buildings, and people that have gone on to become contractors in those materials, and that was the proving ground. And I'm curious to know, if we look at ADUs and we look at cottage units and start to move down into this tiny home spectrum and think about the affordability issue and owner-built housing, what have you become excited about in terms of sustainable materials and technologies that are showing up in the environment? And where are we going to go? What's the next thing in terms of like the wonderful discoveries that we have to make?
Bad pitch to Joe Becker.
Well, the world of innovation is really blossoming, and people are there's all kinds of things happening, and they're just kind of lost in the sea of information, and so distilling some of that down, I think things like the Dignity Village, but in different forms, creating new experimental zones. How do we really offer? I mean, to me, what's next is not only cultivating like civic stewardship with you all, and how do we create new institutions connected to the city, within the city, like create a web that's more like an organism. Because right now, Google works more like an organism than the City of Olympia and its community, for sure. Because they got systems in place and all the connective tissue in place, and there's a lot of money to be made and they do it well. But how do we, as citizens in the city, create civic stewardship labs and organisms, and then beyond that, creating experimental zones is a really exciting, or experimental permits, or how do we've got to follow public safety stuff, but like how do we incentivize innovation is exciting to me, because there's a lot of innovation out there, and really you can just transplant it, in a really good way. If you have the information, you take it to the city, and there's an infrastructure for it. Look, this has been done here. I want to do this. What's the infrastructure to help make that possible? And maybe there's like a bunch of trained omnibus persons that work for city planning. Anyway, that's anybody else have an answer? Chris, you have it?
Oh, I would say, shipping containers are an interesting prospect that some folks in Seattle are working on, and others around the region. Joseph, you are underselling yourself by not talking about, straw bale and cob and straw clay installation with timber framing. Those are great materials that bring out that sense of stewardship in the owners and the people that come to help them build their home. It's in someone's backyard as an ADU. Well, we all get together and build this house. Now there's a new unit, and we can be friends with the person who lives there. So there's a lot of good innovation there. I really like the idea that within our existing neighborhoods, we could have little villages where there are shared resources within those villages. There are people living simply, the not so big house, living small and simple, small is beautiful, and then sharing what they can. You know, I mean, what if we had 20 Quixote villages and all kinds of different people got to live in them, not just the folks who are trying to get a roof over their head for the first time in 10 years. I mean, I would live in that. So that's the thing that I'm excited about, is the idea of tiny home villages, and to be really creative in the way those are built, so that the participants who are going to live there can actually participate in building those structures, which normally, because they're required to be built to code, you have to do it with licensed bonded contractors. But when you work with someone like Joseph, he's the bonded contractor, but he's just facilitating. The owners get to build. So I mean, how can we work that into the infrastructure?
I was just going to say that, I mean, in a way, what you're talking about is already happening now, and just the way that tiny houses on wheels interact in the neighborhood. Like where I live on a retired couple's property, and like we have such an awesome relationship, and like we use their laundry, we use their bathroom, you know, they take care of our cat when we're gone, we take care of their cat when they're gone, and feed their fish, and water the plants, and like and we have communal meals together sometimes. Like I have a different kind of relationship to my neighbors and to my community, because there is this reciprocal relationship, which makes me feel amazing, but it's also like this place of vulnerability. You know, everybody's so about, I want to own everything that I need in my super, you know, designed space that has everything. And I mean, I purposely designed my house without a bathroom, because I wanted to, like, you know, make my impact on the land not as intense, but also to be able to have that relationship. And so it exists, I think, but it's, again, it doesn't necessarily have to be in a village. It can just be one house and a relationship with the person who owns the land, so.
Okay, on that note, we will close. I just want to say, I can feel change happening. And I know that everybody who wants to participate in that change will remember to sign up on the email list for both OPOP and Leonard. And I just want to say how pleased and wonderful it is to see all of you here tonight, and to know that I will be seeing you again soon.
You did a really good job.
Thank you.